The lights in the studio were bright, almost blinding, but that was nothing new for Steve Harvey. For years he had been walking onto this very stage, microphone in hand, ready to entertain millions of viewers with his quick jokes, heartfelt advice, and larger-than-life personality. His daytime talk show had become a staple in households across America. People tuned in not just for laughs, but also for moments of inspiration. But today felt different. There was an energy in the room that even Steve couldn't quite put his finger on. As the audience settled into their seats, chattering excitedly about who might be appearing on the show, Steve stood backstage, glancing over the guest list one last time. He always made it a point to know a little bit about each person he interviewed. It wasn't just about asking questions, it was about connecting with them, making them feel seen and heard. And today, one name stood out more than the others. Karoline Leavitt. Karoline wasn't a household name like some of the celebrities Steve usually hosted, but her story had already made headlines. She was a young woman whose life had taken a dramatic turn after a series of personal struggles. What caught Steve's attention wasn't just her resilience, it was how she had turned her pain into purpose. After battling depression and anxiety, following a tragic loss in her family, Karoline had dedicated herself to raising awareness about mental health. Her advocacy work had touched countless lives, and she had become a beacon of hope for those silently suffering. Steve smiled to himself as he thought about what kind of conversation they'd have. He loved talking to guests who weren't afraid to share their truth, especially when it could inspire others. Still, he didn't expect this segment to stand out too much from the rest of the show. After all, emotional interviews were part of the job. People came on his show to tell their stories, and Steve did his best to make sure those stories resonated with the audience. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was about to happen. When it was finally time to start the show, Steve walked out onto the stage to thunderous applause. The crowd loved him, and he fed off their energy every single day. Dressed in his signature suit, tie slightly loosened for comfort, he greeted everyone with his trademark charm. "Good morning, everybody," he boomed, flashing his megawatt smile. The audience cheered even louder, clearly excited to see what the day's episode held. After running through a few light-hearted segments, a funny clip reel, and a game involving audience members, Steve turned serious. "All right, folks," he said, leaning casually against his desk. "Now we're going to switch gears a little bit. Today I've got someone incredibly special joining me. Her name is Karoline Leavitt, and trust me, you're going to want to hear what she has to say." The camera panned to the side entrance, where Karoline stood waiting for her cue. She looked calm but determined, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause once again. Steve extended his hand to welcome her, and they shook hands warmly before taking their seats. From the moment she sat down, there was an undeniable sense of anticipation in the air. Something about Karoline's presence commanded attention, not in a flashy or attention-seeking way, but in a quiet, powerful manner that drew people in. "Karoline, thank you so much for being here," Steve began, his tone warm and inviting. "Before we dive in, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Just give the audience a glimpse into who you are." Karoline nodded, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Of course, Steve. Thank you for having me. Well, I'm just a regular person, really. I grew up in a small town, went to school, started working, the usual stuff. But about 5 years ago, my life changed completely. My younger brother passed away unexpectedly, and it threw my entire world into chaos." The room fell silent. Even the crew members behind the cameras stopped moving, captivated by her words. Steve leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. He knew this kind of story, the kind that could break your heart. But he also knew that sometimes these were the most important ones to share. "I think a lot of people assume that because I seem okay now, I must have bounced back right away," Karoline continued. "But the truth is, I didn't. I struggled immensely. I felt like I was drowning, like no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't keep my head above water. Some days, getting out of bed felt impossible. Other days, I would go through the motions, pretending everything was fine, but inside I was falling apart." Steve nodded slowly, absorbing every word. That sounds incredibly tough, he said gently. What kept you going during those times? Karoline hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. Honestly, it was a combination of things. Therapy helped a lot. I finally realized I didn't have to face everything alone. But there were also little moments that gave me hope. Like watching shows like yours, Steve. Seeing people laugh, hearing stories that reminded me life could still be beautiful. Those small things mattered more than I realized at the time. Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on, determined to finish. Eventually, I decided I wanted to use my experience to help others. That's why I started speaking out about mental health. If I can reach even one person who feels like they're stuck, then everything I went through will have been worth it. The audience remained silent, hanging on her every word. Steve glanced around the room, noticing how intently everyone was listening. This wasn't just another interview. It was a moment of connection, a reminder that none of us are truly alone in our struggles. Little did anyone know, including Steve, that this conversation was about to take an unexpected turn, revealing emotions buried deep beneath the surface. As the interview continued, the atmosphere in the studio shifted subtly. The conversation had been heartfelt and inspiring so far, but there was a sense that Karoline wasn't finished sharing her story. Steve could feel it too. There was something. She was holding back, something important that she wanted to say. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers with quiet encouragement. Karoline, he said, his tone warm yet probing. You've already shared so much with us today, and I can tell how much courage it takes to open up like this. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything on your mind that you haven't said yet? For a moment, Karoline hesitated. She glanced down at her lap, her fingers fidgeting nervously with the hem of her sleeve. Then, without saying a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. It was plain white, unassuming, but the way she held it suggested it carried immense weight. The audience leaned forward collectively, their curiosity piqued. I wrote this letter last night, Karoline began, her voice trembling slightly as she handed the envelope to Steve. I wasn't sure if I should bring it, but I think it's important. Steve accepted the envelope, his brow furrowing in confusion. A letter? He asked, turning it over in his hands. For me? Yes. Karoline replied softly, nodding. It's for you. Please read it. The room fell silent. Even the crew members behind the cameras seemed to hold their breath, unsure of what was about to unfold. Steve carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the neatly written note inside. As his eyes scanned the first few lines, his expression began to change. The usual confidence and charisma that defined him softened, replaced by something deeper, an emotion he rarely showed on camera. Wow, he murmured under his breath, pausing to glance up at Karoline before continuing to read aloud. Okay, here goes. Dear Steve, I hope this letter finds you well. I never imagined I'd be writing these words to you, but after everything you've done for me, even though you may not realize it, I felt like I needed to say thank you. Steve paused again, visibly taken aback. He looked at Karoline, who sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. This is incredible, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. Keep going. She nodded silently, urging him to continue. When my world fell apart, I didn't know where to turn. I felt lost, broken, and completely alone. Some days getting out of bed felt impossible. But during those darkest moments, your show became my lifeline. Watching you laugh, hearing your stories, seeing the joy you brought to others, it reminded me that life could still be beautiful, even when I couldn't see it myself. There were mornings when I would cry while watching your interviews because they made me miss my brother so much. Other times I laughed until my sides hurt, and for those brief moments I forgot about the pain. You have no idea how much those little things meant to me. They gave me hope when I needed it most. But more than anything, Steve, you taught me something I'll carry with me forever. Resilience. Seeing how you handle challenges, how you make people feel seen and valued, it inspired me to keep fighting. You reminded me that we all have struggles, but we also have the power to overcome them. So thank you. Thank you for being more than just a comedian or a talk show host. Thank you for being a beacon of light when I couldn't find my own. And thank you for giving me the strength to believe that I could one day help someone else the way you helped me. By the time Steve finished reading, the studio was utterly silent. His hands trembled slightly as he lowered the letter, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For someone who prided himself on keeping his composure, this was uncharted territory. He blinked rapidly, trying to steady himself, but the emotions bubbling beneath the surface were undeniable. "Karoline," he started, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control, but the lump in his throat wouldn't budge. "I don't even know what to say. This means more to me than I can put into words." The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the studio. Many people wiped away tears, moved not only by the content of the letter, but also by the raw vulnerability displayed by both Steve and Karoline. Steve took a deep breath, placing the letter gently on the desk in front of him. "You have no idea how much this touches me," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I mean, I do what I do because I love making people laugh, because I want to spread positivity and joy. But hearing that it actually made a difference in someone's life, someone like you, it's overwhelming. It humbles me." Karoline smiled through her own tears, reaching out to place a reassuring hand on his arm. "That's why I wanted you to read it, Steve, because you deserve to know the impact you've had, not just on me, but on so many others who watch your show every day." Steve shook his head, still processing everything. "I never thought about it like that," he admitted. "You always hear people say, oh, TV shows can't really change lives. But then you come along and prove them wrong. You remind me why I got into this business in the first place, to connect with people, to let them know they're not alone." The sincerity in his voice resonated throughout the room. Even the crew members, usually focused solely on their tasks, found themselves captivated by the moment. It was rare to witness such genuine human connection, especially on live television, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something special. "I want to ask you something," Steve said after a pause, his composure slowly returning. "Do you think other people realize how strong you are? How brave you are for speaking out like this?" Karoline shrugged modestly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't know, Steve. Sometimes I wonder if anyone notices, but honestly, that's not why I do it. I share my story because I want others to know it's okay to struggle. It's okay to ask for help. If even one person hears my message and feels less alone, then I've done my job." Her humility struck a chord with Steve. He nodded slowly, his admiration for her growing with each passing second. "You know, Karoline, you're proof that strength doesn't always look the same. It's not always loud or flashy. Sometimes it's quiet, like yours. And sometimes it comes in the form of a simple letter that changes someone's perspective forever." The audience erupted into applause once again, their cheers filling the studio with warmth and gratitude. Steve turned to face them, raising his hands to signal for quiet. When the noise subsided, he looked back at Karoline, his eyes shining. "With newfound respect, we're going to take a quick break," he announced, addressing the audience. "But trust me, we're not done yet. There's so much more to talk about, and I'm honored to have you here, Karoline. Truly." As the cameras cut to commercial, Steve remained seated, staring at the letter in front of him. He picked it up, again, rereading the words that had touched him so deeply. Meanwhile, Karoline sat quietly beside him, her heart full knowing she had shared something meaningful, not just with Steve, but with everyone watching at home. Little did they know, however, that the emotional journey was far from over. When the show returned from the commercial break, the energy in the studio was electric. The audience had been buzzing during the pause, whispering to one another about what they'd just witnessed. For many, it wasn't just another talk show moment. It felt like something bigger, something that transcended the usual entertainment value of daytime television. Steve and Karoline sat side by side, both visibly moved but determined to continue their conversation. Steve took a deep breath before speaking, his voice steadier now but still tinged with emotion. All right, folks, he began, addressing the audience with a small smile. If you're just tuning in, let me catch you up real quick. We've got Karoline Leavitt here today, a remarkable woman who has shared her story of overcoming incredible challenges. And if that wasn't enough, she handed me a letter earlier that, well, let's just say it hit home. The audience clapped again, their applause filled with genuine appreciation. Steve held up the letter briefly, as if reminding everyone of its significance, then placed it back on the desk. He turned to Karoline, his expression softer than usual. Karoline, I need to ask you something, he said, leaning forward slightly. When you wrote this letter, did you expect it to have such an impact not just on me but on everyone watching? Karoline hesitated for a moment, clearly thinking about her answer. Honestly, Steve, I didn't know how you'd react, she admitted. I just knew I needed to write it. Writing has always been my way of processing things, and after everything your show has meant to me, I felt like I owed it to myself, and to you, to express my gratitude. Steve nodded slowly, absorbing her words. You know, I spend a lot of time thinking about why I do what I do, why I get up every morning, put on this suit, and come out here to entertain people. Most days I tell myself it's because I love making people laugh. But sometimes, I wonder if it really matters. Does it make a difference? And then moments like this happen, and I'm reminded that yes, it does. It absolutely does. His vulnerability resonated deeply with the audience. There were nods of agreement, murmurs of encouragement, and more than a few tears being wiped away. Karoline reached over and placed a hand on his arm, offering silent support. I think what you do matters more than you realize, she said gently. It's not just about the jokes or the games or the interviews. It's about creating a space where people feel safe even if it's just for an hour. That's powerful, Steve. You give people permission to laugh, to cry, to be human. And that's something we all need, especially when life gets hard. Her words hung in the air, simple, yet profound. Steve looked down at the desk, his fingers tracing the edge of the envelope thoughtfully. You know, he said after a moment, I never expected to cry on national television today. Not once in my career have I imagined sitting here, breaking down like this, but here we are. The audience chuckled softly, touched by his honesty. Steve smiled wryly, shaking his head. And you know what? I'm okay with it. Because this isn't just about me. This is about connection. It's about realizing that no matter who we are, whether we're hosting a talk show or struggling to get through the day, we're all human. We all have battles we're fighting, and sometimes we just need someone to remind us that we're not alone. Karoline nodded, her eyes glistening. That's exactly right, Steve, and that's why your platform is so important. You reach millions of people every single day, and you may never know the full extent of the impact you're having. But trust me, it's there. People are listening. People are healing. The sincerity in her voice struck a chord with everyone in the room. Even the crew members, who typically remained detached while working, found themselves pausing to take it all in. It was rare to witness such raw authenticity, and it served as a reminder of why storytelling matters. Steve exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face as he composed himself. All right, he said with a small laugh. Let's shift gears for a second. I've cried enough for one day. Now I want to hear more about you, Karoline. How has sharing your story affected you personally? Has it changed the way you see yourself? Karoline tilted her head, considering the question. That's a great question, she replied. At first, I was terrified to open up. I worried people would judge me or think I was weak. But the more I shared my journey, the more I realized that vulnerability is actually a strength. It takes courage to admit you're struggling, and every time I do, I feel a little lighter, like I'm letting go of some of the weight I've been carrying. Steve listened intently, nodding along. I can relate to that, he said. There's something freeing about being honest, isn't there? Whether it's through laughter, tears, or just telling the truth, it helps us connect with others in a way that nothing else can. Exactly, Karoline agreed. And that's what keeps me going. Knowing that my story might inspire someone, else to speak up, to seek help, or even just to believe that things can get better. It makes it all worth it. The audience erupted into applause once again, their cheers echoing through the studio. Steve stood up, gesturing for Karoline to join him. Together, they walked to the front of the stage, facing the crowd. The cameras zoomed in as Steve wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close in a gesture of solidarity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice strong and steady now. "This is what it's all about. Moments like this. Connections like this. If there's one thing I hope you take away from today's show, it's this. Don't underestimate the power of kindness. A kind word, a listening ear, a simple act of compassion. It can change someone's life. And sometimes you won't even realize it until years later, when they hand you a letter like this one." He held up the envelope once more, eliciting another round of applause. Karoline smiled beside him, her eyes shining with gratitude. The two of them stood there for a moment, basking in the warmth of the audience's response. As the segment drew to a close, Steve turned to Karoline one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "For coming here today, for sharing your story, and for reminding me why I do what I do. You've made a lasting impact on me, and I know you'll keep making an impact on countless others." Karoline hugged him tightly, whispering, "Thank you, Steve." In that embrace, both host and guest shared a powerful connection, one that transcended the typical boundaries of a talk show interview. It was a moment of mutual respect, gratitude, and humanity that left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. As the cameras cut to another commercial break, the audience continued to cheer, unwilling to let the moment fade. Backstage, Steve took a moment to collect himself, wiping away the last remnants of tears. He glanced at the letter one final time, tucking it safely into his pocket. Little did he know this episode would go on to become one of the most memorable in the history of his show, sparking conversations about mental health and reminding viewers everywhere that behind every smile, there may be a silent struggle, and sometimes all it takes is one person to make a difference. As the final segment of the show approached, Steve Harvey took a moment to reflect on everything that had transpired. The studio was alive with energy, but it wasn't the usual excitement brought on by celebrity gossip or funny games. This was different, deeper, more meaningful. Even the audience seemed reluctant to let the moment slip away, their applause lingering longer than usual as Steve and Karoline returned to their seats. "All right, folks," Steve began, his voice calm but tinged with emotion. "We're nearing the end of today's episode, but before we wrap things up, I want to take a step back and talk about what this conversation has meant, not just for me, but hopefully for all of us." He turned to Karoline, who sat beside him, her posture relaxed yet poised. Despite the emotional weight of the day, she radiated a quiet strength that inspired everyone around her. "Karoline, you've been incredibly open and honest with us today," Steve continued. "And I think it's important to acknowledge something. Sharing your story isn't easy. It takes guts to put yourself out there like this. So, first and foremost, thank you for trusting me, for trusting this audience, and for being brave enough to speak your truth." Karoline smiled warmly, her eyes soft but resolute. "Thank you, Steve. I wouldn't have done it if I didn't believe in the power of these conversations. Every time I share my journey, I remind myself that I'm not alone, and I hope others feel the same way." Steve nodded thoughtfully, leaning forward slightly as he addressed both Karoline and the audience. "You know, one thing I keep coming back to is how interconnected we all are. We go through life thinking we're isolated in our struggles, like nobody else understands what we're dealing with. But then moments like this happen, and we realize just how universal those feelings are. Pain, loss, fear, they don't discriminate. They touch every single one of us at some point. And when we open up about them, we create space for healing, not just for ourselves, but for others too." The audience murmured in agreement, many nodding along as they absorbed his words. Steve paused, letting the sentiment sink in before continuing. "I think that's why your advocacy work is so powerful, Karoline. You're not just talking about mental health, You're showing people that it's okay to be vulnerable, that it's okay to ask for help. And that's a message the world desperately needs to hear. Karoline's expression softened further, her gratitude evident. That's exactly what I hope people take away from this, she said. Mental health isn't something to be ashamed of. It's part of being human. And the more we normalize those conversations, the easier it becomes for people to seek support when they need it. Steve leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other as he processed her response. You know, I've learned something today too, he admitted. I've always known that laughter can heal. It's why I do what I do. But I never fully realized how much impact simply being present can have. Whether it's through a joke, a kind word, or even just listening, we all have the ability to make someone's day a little brighter. Sometimes it's the smallest gestures that leave the biggest impressions. He glanced down at the letter still tucked safely in his pocket, its presence grounding him. This letter reminded me of that, he added. It reminded me that we don't always know the ripple effects of our actions. Maybe someone watching this show right now will decide to call a friend they haven't spoken to in years. Or maybe they'll finally reach out to a therapist, or maybe they'll just feel a little less alone. Whatever it is, it matters. The audience erupted into applause once again, their cheers filling the studio with warmth. Steve raised his hands to signal for quiet, though his smile betrayed how much he appreciated their enthusiasm. Now I want to leave you all with one last thought, he said, his tone serious but hopeful. Life is unpredictable. There are highs and lows, joys and sorrows, victories and setbacks. But no matter where you are on your journey, remember this: you are not alone. There are people who care about you, who want to see you succeed, and who are rooting for you, even if you can't see it right now. Karoline nodded emphatically, adding her own thoughts. And don't forget to be that person for someone else, she urged. A simple act of kindness, a text, a hug, a compliment can change someone's entire day. You might not realize it, but you could be the reason someone keeps going. Her words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom exchanged knowing glances or reached for tissues to dab at their eyes. Steve placed a hand on hers, squeezing gently as he looked into the camera. Let's make a promise to each other, all right? He said, addressing the viewers at home. Let's promise to check in on the people we love, to listen without judgment, to extend compassion whenever we can, because in the end, that's what truly matters. The connections we build, the lives we touch, and the love we share. The room fell silent for a brief moment, the weight of his message settling over everyone. Then, as if on cue, the audience burst into applause once more, their cheers echoing through the studio. Steve stood up, gesturing for Karoline to join him at center stage. Together, they faced the crowd, basking in the collective energy of gratitude and inspiration. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up one more time for Karoline Leavitt, Steve announced, his voice booming with pride. The audience obliged enthusiastically, rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Karoline waved humbly, her cheeks flushed with emotion. She mouthed a silent, "Thank you," to the crowd, her heart swelling with gratitude. As the cameras panned out for the closing shot, Steve wrapped an arm around Karoline's shoulders, pulling her close. "Thank you for joining us today," he told the audience, his trademark charm returning. "And remember, tomorrow is a new day, full of possibilities. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other." With that, the credits rolled, signaling the end of the episode. Backstage, the crew gathered around Steve and Karoline, congratulating them on a job well done. For Steve, it was a reminder of why he loved hosting a talk show: to connect with people, to spark meaningful conversations, and to remind everyone that they're valued. For Karoline, it was validation that her mission was making a difference, one story at a time. Later that evening, clips from the interview went viral online, sparking discussions about mental health, vulnerability, and the importance of human connection. Viewers flooded social media with messages of gratitude, sharing their own stories and vowing to spread kindness. It was proof that moments like this, the raw, unfiltered exchanges between two people willing to be vulnerable, could transcend the screen and leave a lasting impact on the world. For Steve Harvey, it was a day he would never forget. And for Karoline Leavitt, It was another step toward fulfilling her purpose, reminding others that even in their darkest moments, they are never truly alone. As Karoline finished her introduction, there was a brief pause in the conversation. The audience sat quietly, absorbing the weight of her words. Steve, ever the skilled host, knew exactly how to keep the momentum going without rushing her. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk, and looked directly at Karoline with genuine curiosity. "You know, Karoline," he began, his voice softer than usual. "A lot of people go through tough times, but not everyone finds the strength to turn their pain into something positive. What made you decide to speak out about mental health? Was there a specific moment that pushed you to take action?" Karoline took a deep breath, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her chair. She seemed to be gathering her thoughts, choosing her words carefully before responding. "That's a great question, Steve," she said finally. "And honestly, it wasn't one big moment, it was a series of small realizations over time. At first, I didn't want to talk about what I was going through. I thought if I ignored it, maybe it would just go away. But the more I tried to pretend everything was okay, the worse I felt." Steve nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I think a lot of us do that. We put on this mask like, hey, I'm fine, even when we're not. It's almost like we're scared of being judged or misunderstood." "Exactly," Karoline agreed, her voice gaining confidence. "But then, something happened that changed everything for me. One day I was scrolling through social media, and I came across a post from someone who had been struggling with depression. They wrote about how they felt completely alone, like nobody understood what they were going through. And you know what struck me? I realized I used to feel the exact same way. For so long, I thought I was the only one carrying this heavy burden. But reading that post reminded me that I wasn't alone. And neither was that person." She paused, looking down at her hands for a moment before continuing. "That's when it hit me. If I could share my story, maybe I could help someone else feel less alone. Maybe I could show them that it's possible to get through the darkest moments and come out stronger on the other side." The sincerity in her voice was undeniable, and the audience hung on to every word. Some people nodded along, while others wiped tears from their eyes. Even Steve, who was known for keeping interviews light and upbeat, found himself deeply moved by her honesty. He let out a slow exhale, leaning back in his chair for a moment as if processing everything she'd said. "You know, Karoline," he said after a beat, "what you're doing takes a lot of courage. A lot of people wouldn't have the guts to stand up and say, hey, this is what I've been through. But here you are using your experience to make a difference. That's powerful." Karoline smiled faintly, though her eyes still carried a hint of sadness. "Thank you, Steve. It hasn't always been easy, though. There are days when I wonder if I'm making any impact at all. Sometimes it feels like, no matter how much I try, the world keeps moving forward without noticing. But then I'll get a message from someone saying, 'Your story saved me,' or 'You gave me hope when I needed it most.' Those moments remind me why I started doing this in the first place." Steve tilted his head, intrigued. "Do you mind sharing one of those messages with us? If it's okay, of course." Karoline hesitated for a moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her notifications until she found what she was looking for. "This one came last week," she explained, holding up the screen so Steve could see. "It's from a girl named Sarah. She said she'd been feeling hopeless for months, too afraid to tell anyone what she was going through. Then she stumbled across one of my videos online, and it made her realize she wasn't alone. Now she's seeing a therapist and starting to rebuild her life." Steve raised his eyebrows, clearly impressed. "Wow, that's incredible. You really never know how far your words can reach, do you?" "No, you don't," Karoline replied, putting her phone back in her bag. "And honestly, that's part of what keeps me going. Knowing that something I said or did might inspire someone else. To keep fighting, it makes all the hard days worth it." The room grew quiet again, the gravity of her words sinking in. Steve glanced around, noticing how intently everyone was listening. This wasn't just another talk show segment. It was a moment of connection, a reminder that behind every smile, There may be a silent struggle. He decided to shift the conversation slightly, curious to learn more about how Karoline managed to stay resilient despite everything she'd faced. "So, let me ask you this," he said, leaning forward once again. "When things got really tough, like rock-bottom tough, how did you find the strength to keep going? Was there anything specific that helped you pull through?" Karoline thought for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling as if searching for the right answer. "Well, therapy was a huge part of it," she admitted. "I couldn't have done it without professional help. But beyond that, I think it was learning to forgive myself. For so long, I blamed myself for not being able to fix things, whether it was saving my brother or snapping out of my own depression. It took a long time to realize that some things are beyond our control, and that's okay. We're human. We're allowed to hurt, to grieve, to stumble. What matters is that we keep trying." Her vulnerability resonated deeply with the audience. Several people nodded in agreement, while others exchanged knowing glances with their neighbors. Steve, too, seemed affected by her words. He rested his chin on his hand, studying her face intently. "You know, Karoline," he said softly, "a lot of people probably don't realize how much strength it takes to admit that, to acknowledge your pain and work through it instead of running away from it. I think that's something we could all learn from." Karoline smiled, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. "Thanks, Steve. That means a lot coming from you." For a moment, the two of them simply sat there, the silence between them speaking volumes. It was clear that this conversation was heading somewhere profound, though neither of them knew exactly where yet. Little did they realize, however, that the most emotional part of the interview was still to come, and it would leave an indelible mark on both of them.